moment, the US president, before departing for Alaska to meet the Russian President Vladimir Putin, said that Moscow had lost an oil client, which is India. In fact, Trump also pointed out that India, which earlier sourced around 40% of its crude from Russia, had scaled back while China continues to buy significantly. He also added that secondary sanctions, if imposed, would be quote-unquote devastating for Moscow, even though he hinted that he may not need to enforce them. In fact, his comments come just days after he threatened a 50% tariff on Indian imports, and he linked it to New Delhi's oil trade with Russia. So what follows next? How will the markets be reading this? And most importantly, is there relief in store for countries, for instance, India, upon whom secondary sanctions have been imposed? Well, to discuss all of that and more, I'm now joined by a stellar panel of guests this morning. We're now joined by Alistair Newton, the CEO of Alavant Business Advisory. Also joining us is Sunil Subramaniam. He's a market expert. And of course, Peter Maguire, the CEO of AustraliaTrading.com. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for taking the time out and speaking to us here on ET Now this morning. Let me come to you first, Mr. Newton. Now, Trump and Putin have been calling this meeting productive. However, there was nothing concrete, no ceasefire declaration either. How much was today's meeting about show versus substance?
Well, I think you've hit the nail right on the head, Sumita. A Ukrainian official described the meeting after the event as a nothing burger. And I think that's actually a pretty fair description. As far as I can tell, nothing came out of this except for a big win for Vladimir Putin. He's set foot on American soil for the first time for over a decade. He's come away from Anchorage without making any concessions whatsoever. Something. And presumably we have to reckon that Trump is probably going to exert some pressure on Ukraine to try to get Ukraine to make concessions over territory in particular, which are going to be very, very difficult for President Zelenskyy domestically. And let's keep in mind that this is with no guarantee whatsoever of a ceasefire at any stage at the moment. So I don't think we've actually gone anywhere at all, except in terms of the beginning, as the Moscow press is crowing today, of rehabilitating Vladimir Putin in the eyes of the Western community. Now, having said that, you've also raised the important question of secondary sanctions. We're not clear exactly what's going to happen on that either, but I would say tentatively that provisionally this is one piece of good news for India at least, but let's wait and see what happens on that. But in terms of substance on Ukraine and the war, as far as I can tell, no progress. And if Steve Witkoff is still in the driving seat for the US in dealings with Russia, I think the Ukrainians need to be very concerned indeed about the implications of this meeting.
Absolutely, Mr. Newton. We're still awaiting a statement from the Western leaders, and of course, Ukraine as well. And it remains to be seen how those statements will come out and how will it impact Ukraine. But Peter, would you agree with Mr. Newton the fact that the optics were rather startling? A red carpet was laid out for President Putin in U.S. territory. There were no questions being taken post the presser. No sanctions either have been announced. So has this meeting legitimized Putin's re-entry into the Western world, and has the United States in that process ended up giving way too much to Putin?
Well, I don't think they gave too much. It was certainly, you've got a Russian leader there, and that needs to be displayed from a etiquette standpoint. And you're welcoming him onto American soil. There is no doubt, and I follow what Alistair said. It's pretty hard to argue with his case. The reality of the matter is that it's probably going to be very much a work in progress. How the market's going to, which I would think read into it, is I don't think you're going to see a lot of volatility coming from it. I think at the first stage, I think you probably see, as President Putin said, he's looking for another meeting, possibly in Russia, in Moscow. And you're looking at timelines, and then President Trump saying that he'll be phoning President Zelenskyy, and that, I believe, should have happened by now, or certainly in the next matter of hours. So that'll be interesting to see whether he's prepared to move forward, and certainly his European counterparts. So it's certainly a very much a work in progress. And I don't think you get a deal like this done in an afternoon. So I'm expecting it to probably drag out for a while, and we'll just have to wait and see whether something concrete is going to be achieved, and the brinkmanship from both leaders and naturally European counterparts and President Zelenskyy.
Right, Peter, it remains to be seen whether something concrete comes out of these talks and what really happens next and how soon these talks with the Ukrainian president, they can be scheduled and what's his point of view on these talks going to be. But let me come to you, Mr. Subramaniam, and thank you very much for patiently waiting. Now, Donald Trump, post the presser, said that many points were agreed to, but a few remain. What could possibly he be hinting or referring to when he says that a few remain, but many were agreed to?
So I think that it's basically territory driven. I think Russia has occupied certain key Ukrainian territories, and which are the ones he's willing to give away, which Putin wants to retain. I think those are the two big things. Otherwise, if you see, he said 8 out of 10 agreements have been, areas have been mostly conclusive. In fact, he's rated the meeting 10 on 10 from that perspective. So why I'm saying this is he was very clear that he's not seeking a solution from this meeting. Even before this meeting, he said that, yes, the next stage would be for a meeting with Mr. Zelenskyy and Russia and the US probably together. So from what he wanted to get away, I think he's gotten away with that. So to that extent, the meeting must be described as a success because people who are expecting a solution to the war from this, I think that was not even what Mr. Trump was expecting. So these two big things are one thing, but I think that more importantly, it indicates an easing of relationship between Trump and Russia, between US and Russia. And that's extremely good news from what I see. Because let's say that Mr. Putin has agreed to certain things and then these two are disputable. Now he's going to speak to NATO, get them to agree to Mr. Putin's terms. If they don't, Mr. Trump can always claim that, look, I brought a deal to the table. You guys are not accepting. Now do what you want. So why I'm saying this is that clearly this represents that Mr. Trump and Putin have agreed on certain things. And why I'm saying from an India-based observer and from our country's perspective, Russia and the US getting to a calmer space between themselves is only positive for us. Because we talked about, the additional sanctions which could come through if this meeting was a disaster. That's not going to happen. And second is that if at all things don't go through, it's not a failure of Putin-Trump meeting. So see, it's not Mr. Trump's failure. Second thing is, remember, he's dealing with a leader who has no democracy to go and represent his case to. What Mr. Putin is an ultimate decision maker. Right. So even if he decides to give up some Russian wins there, nobody's going to object to him. So he's talking to a person who can conclude a deal. Whereas that's not necessarily true in other countries with our democracy. Right. So I think to that extent, it's positive, especially from an India perspective. I think that this looks like a danger which was there of secondary sanctions not being there. And if at all things get worsened, he may now need to act on China as far as their oil imports and not certainly puts more pressure on India because he's taken the India pressure to the extent it can now.
Right. Right, Mr. Subramaniam, very valid points that you have made, and of course remains to be seen how this meeting is going to impact India and will there be any relief inside? And we'll come to that question a little later, but let me take off from the point that you made about the fact that, this chapter really marks a new turn in Russia-US ties. And let me take that question to Mr. Newton. Mr. Newton, would you agree with Mr. Subramaniam, and how do you think the markets will be reacting to this meeting?
Well, I would defer to Peter on that really, because I'm not a market expert, but for what it's worth, my own view is that markets are likely to take this as neutral for the time being. I can't see any particular reason for markets to react one way or the other. I don't think the non-outcome, which is how I'm going to look at it at least, of yesterday's summit is a surprise to anybody. I know Donald Trump said before the meeting that there was only a 25% probability of failure. We have to be careful about what he means by failure. Clearly, the meeting was not a failure in that, as I think we've all agreed, there was never going to be a deal yesterday unless it was a very bad deal for Ukraine. So we do need to see this as a process. I think investors will continue to see it as a process, and they will be very much in wait and see mode. But as I said earlier, and I agree with Mr. Subramaniam about this, I think overall it is quite good news for India. But I also think we need to be quite cautious about that because in many respects, I don't think Russia is the big problem in India's relations with the US right now. I think you need to be much more concerned in India about the way in which Pakistan's leadership has succeeded in seducing Mr. Trump to an extent with flattery, with a nomination for a Nobel Peace Prize, and so on and so forth. And that's where I would be looking primarily for any movement on US attitudes towards India at this time.
Absolutely, and that remains to be seen, Mr. Newton. Let me come to you, Peter, on that question about markets. How do you expect investors to move their monies? How do you expect the markets to sort of react upon this news? Do you anticipate more volatility in the coming few days?
Well, I think first off, we're in for a very big week as far as Jackson Hole, so we can't discount that at all. The markets, you could see US dollar come under a little bit further pressure to the downside, in the sense where there wasn't a deal done. That made a reasonable expectation as far as a little bit of US dollar softness. Gold could have a little bit of movement to the upside. Equities were very flat when you're thinking of what happened, on Friday's close in New York. So I think that Asia will probably inhale this on Monday morning as relatively flat. I'm not expecting anything dramatic to really push the market around, because nothing dramatically has come out of this as yet. If there was a deal that was done and all of a sudden it's a change in the whole footprint as far as the Ukraine situation and Russia, which I don't think anyone really expected to happen. But if that happened, that would have changed the landscape. But that hasn't happened. So I'm thinking relatively a slowish sort of start across Asia on Monday. And I'm keeping a very close eye naturally on US dollar and Fed talks this week.
Right, Peter. So, of course, a flattish movement is what you're anticipating for the markets. But let me take that question across to Mr. Subramaniam. Mr. Subramaniam, the FIIs, particularly with respect to the India market, they've been on a selling spree. There's been a bit of volatility on that front. Is that going to continue further? And how do you really see the Indian market moving forward in the near term? Do you think we're going to be largely insulated due to domestic investor interest?
So I agree with Peter that markets will be relatively calm about this news. They don't need to really jump up. But like he said, Jackson Hole for the US, we have a big thing here in terms of the GST rationalization that the Prime Minister announced yesterday in his Independence Day speech. The details are going to come out, and there's going to be almost 98% of the items are going to see a reduction in GST. Which is likely to be signed before Diwali. So the market should react positively on the consumption stocks and the banking related stocks on Monday. So the markets will be up. How much of it can be attributed to this easing of Trump-Putin relationship? How much to the local factors we have to see? I do expect the markets to be positive. And FIIs also, because they will see this growth in the Indian consumption sector, may come in and start buying into FMCG and consumer discretionary stocks. So I think the Indian market will respond positively. Not all can be attributed to this Trump-Putin meeting, but definitely there are enough wins here. The second point I wanted to stress here is what we talked about, the fact that Pakistan is taking an edge over India in terms of, and that's what the main problem is. But only one thing I would like to say here, two things actually. One is that India is not for sale. We are not willing to give up our Bitcoin just to make up with the president. We are not willing to put him onto Nobel Prize just because of our deal. We are a nation which is strong on our own. So I think there's pride at stake here. We're not going to put all those just to have a good relationship with Mr. Trump. Number two is that Mr. Trump hasn't helped that cause by using very damaging language. He called them obnoxious tariff-related thing. He also called India a dead economy. So he's not the most popular person in India right now. And India has also taken a fairly firm, I would say, an iron hand in a velvet glove stance to this. We are not fighting tooth for tooth or throwing insult after insult, but we are staying firm on saying that buying oil from Russia, it will be based on our economic needs and what our citizens need. So what I'm saying is there's going to be a different way that this relationship pans out. So to that extent that, like I said again, the secondary sanctions may ease away. And the 50% tariff on India, I treat the 25% as an economic tariff, the second 25% as a political tariff. So now I see the chances for that political tariff to actually, maybe ease up in the coming weeks based on how this goes. Because I don't think Mr. Trump is going to be now angry with Putin for anything, because I think Putin has said, I'm looking to end the war. So to that extent, whatever he wanted to punish India as a route to making Putin agree to a meeting and do something, that's been achieved. So he could ease up on the 25%. That if it's announced in the next couple of weeks will be a huge positive for Indian markets. So that's my take on this situation here.
Right.
The geopolitics of it, I'd like to point out, don't affect the Indian market so much.
Mr. Subramaniam.
The Indian markets react to the Indian impact due to these talks.
In fact, we've been given to understand, Mr. Subramaniam, that within the government that they are watching these developments very closely, given the fact that the elevated 25% tariffs, the outcome of that is really dependent on several geopolitical developments that are happening, and you're suggesting that some relief could be in sight. Let me take that question to you, Mr. Newton. Do you anticipate some relief for India on that front? What kind of relief you're anticipating? And secondly, I also want to ask you about, with this meeting having concluded, what does it really change for the Russia-India-China axis?
I'm always very cautious about trying to anticipate which way Donald Trump is going to go, in part because from day to day, it's not at all clear that he knows which way he's going to go. As Sunil has stressed, Mr. Trump seems to have a number of grievances with India. I do think, though, that there is a pretty fair chance that oil-related secondary sanctions on India will not be enforced, and that the existing threat will dissipate for the time being, not because of Mr. Trump's concern about India, but because of his clear and burning desire to have a very good relationship with Vladimir Putin. His admiration of strongmen is undoubted. I think the points that Sunil made about democracies and Russia not being a democracy is very valid. Trump's admiration for Putin clearly outpaces his past admiration, maybe even still current admiration, but muted for Narendra Modi. So I don't think India is out of the woods, but as I said earlier, I think overall this is quite good news for India potentially. As far as the bigger geopolitical picture is concerned, first of all, I don't think the US has got a cat in hell's chance. It is based on fundamental worldview, and it is what it is. And China will remain close with Russia. It is not a partnership of equals. China is by far the greater of the two equals, if you like, to go a bit Orwellian on it. So I do think that we're going to continue to see a strong relationship there. I also think that, let's go back to the question of secondary sanctions on oil. I don't think there was any chance at all of Trump imposing secondary sanctions on China over buying Russian oil. He clearly wants to do a deal with Xi Jinping. You've only got to consider the steps which the US has taken over the last few weeks. Taiwan, very much in Mr. Trump's sights, the easing of tech embargo, to see that it's not clear that there are any limits to how far Donald Trump would go to get a summit with Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping is playing this extremely well, in my view, in his dealings with the US. Right. India, on the other hand, well, difficult to know. For 25 years or so, it's been a key counterbalance to China in the eyes of America. Wrong, in my view. India will make its own decisions, not be driven by policy from Washington. But I do think that India needs to watch very, very closely how US-China relations are unfolding, given Trump's seeming addiction to the idea of spheres of influence, with China having a sphere of influence in Asia.
Absolutely, Mr. Newton, but India has maintained its strategic autonomy, and it will continue to maintain its strategic autonomy while maintaining ties with different countries. And of course, this is an interesting piece that we'll be watching out for, and we'll be waiting to see how it really unfolds, given the fact that there are talks scheduled later this month for the first tranche of the bilateral trade agreement that both sides are negotiating. Let me come to you, Peter. Now, one very important quote that President Putin said in that joint press conference, that today's agreements will help us restart pragmatic relations. So when he states pragmatic relations between Russia and the United States, is he hinting at a possible economic cooperation and collaboration between Russia and the United States?
Well, we've got to look at it from many lenses. And if we look at it first off and appreciate from an energy perspective, let's look at OPEC Plus and let's look at the US. The US is the largest oil producer in the world. Russia, naturally, too, and Saudi and then Russia. So they're the elephants in the room. So there is no doubt that President Trump's wanting to see cheaper, from a cost perspective, cheaper energy prices, certainly for the US consumers. And this will wash across as we're seeing that as far as energy prices, and we've seen WTI approaching that $60 handle, Brent now at the mid 60s, and that seems to be a downdraft that's very much, I think, embedded over this Q3 timeframe, where we all say that there's going to be a glut as far as oil come the early part of Q4, and that's going to help drive down inflation and be very good from a consumption standpoint, more money in the wallet and the purse of the consumer. So that seems to be the first part of it, and I'm sure that they are in some ways working together to achieve that as far as production. We all understand the situation with secondary tariffs and, China and India buying Russian crude, and the numbers only a few years ago, there was 2 or 3% of Russian crude. Now India's buying about 35, 36%. So it's a dramatic increase. I think the jury's still out whether maybe it was just President Trump's wordings, how to strike a deal or the art of the deal, throw something in there that creates turbulence, which it certainly did from a secondary standpoint as far as any form of, secondary tariffs or impact to the Indian consumer. So I think the early days are that they're going to work together, and this is very much, again, a work in progress, how this all frames. And I think the next couple of weeks are going to be very fascinating.
Right, right. Thank you very much, Peter, Mr. Newton, and of course, Mr. Subramaniam, for your thoughts and views on what is going to happen next. How should this meeting be seen, and how soon a meeting can happen between, of course, President Putin and Zelenskyy, and of course, the briefing that he is supposed to do with NATO members, and how soon a formal path to peace can actually start, that can actually take shape. We'll have to wait and see for all those developments. But for the moment, thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us and taking the time out and speaking to us here on ET Now with your perspectives and your observations on that big story that's currently unfolding. Ladies and gentlemen, with that, it's time's up on this edition of News Now. But you stay tuned. We have lots more coming up on the other side of this break. Thank you.